Chapter 13. Such, then, were Solon's reasons for his departure from the country. After his retirement, the city was still torn by divisions. For 4 years, indeed, they lived in peace, but in the 5th year, after Solon's government, they were unable to elect an archon on account of the dissensions, and again, 4 years later, they elected no archon for the same reason. Subsequently, after a similar period had elapsed, Damasius was elected archon, and he governed for 2 years and 2 months, until he was forcibly expelled from his office. After this, it was agreed, on account of the dissensions, to elect 10 archons, 5 from the Eupatridae, 3 from the Agroici, and 2 from the Demiurgi. And these officers ruled for the year following Damasius. It is clear from this that the archon was at that time the magistrate who possessed the greatest power, since it is always in connection with this office that conflicts are seen to arise. But altogether they were in a continual state of internal disorder. Some found the cause and justification of their discontent in the abolition of debts, because thereby they had been reduced to poverty. Others were dissatisfied with the political constitution, because it had undergone a revolutionary change, while with others the motive was found in personal rivalries among themselves. The parties at this time were 3 in number. First, there was the party of the shore, whose leader was Megacles, the son of Alcmaeon, which was considered to aim at a moderate form of government. Then there were the men of the plain, who desired an oligarchy, and were led by Lycurgus. And thirdly, there were the men of the highlands, at the head of whom was Pisistratus, who was looked on as an extreme democrat. To this latter party were attached those who had been deprived of the debts due to them, from motives of poverty, and those who were not of pure descent, from motives of personal apprehension. A proof of this is seen in the fact that after the tyranny was overthrown, a revision was made of the citizen roll on the ground that many persons were partaking in the franchise without having a right to it. The names given to the respective parties were derived from the districts in which they held their lands. Chapter 14. Pisistratus had the reputation of being an extreme democrat, and he also had distinguished himself greatly in the war with Megara. Taking advantage of this, he wounded himself, and by representing that his injuries had been inflicted on him by his political rivals, he persuaded the people through a motion proposed by Aristion to grant him a bodyguard. After he had got these club-bearers, as they were called, he made an attack with them on the people, and seized the Acropolis. This happened in the archonship of Commaeus, 31 years after the legislation of Solon. It is related that, when Pisistratus asked for his bodyguard, Solon opposed the request, and declared that in so doing he proved himself wiser than half the people, and braver than the rest. Wiser than those who did not see that Pisistratus designed to make himself tyrant, and braver than those who saw it and kept silence. But when all his words availed nothing, he carried forth his armor and set it up in front of his house, saying that he had helped his country so far as lay in his power — he was already a very old man — and that he called on all others to do the same. Solon's exhortations, however, proved fruitless, and Pisistratus assumed the sovereignty. His administration was far more like a constitutional government than the rule of a tyrant, but before his power was firmly established, the adherents of Megacles and Lycurgus made a coalition and drove him out. This took place in the archonship of Hegesias, 5 years after the first establishment of his rule. 11 years later, Megacles, being in difficulties in a party struggle, again opened negotiations with Pisistratus, proposing that the latter should marry his daughter, and on these terms he brought him back to Athens by a very primitive and simple-minded device. He first spread abroad a rumor that Athena was bringing back Pisistratus, and then, having found a woman of great stature and beauty, named Phae (according to Herodotus, of the deme of Paeania, but, as others say, a Thracian flower seller of the deme of Colitus), he dressed her in garb resembling that of the goddess, and brought her into the city with Pisistratus. The latter drove in on a chariot with the woman beside him, and the inhabitants of the city, struck with awe, received him with adoration. Chapter 15. In this manner did his first return take place. He did not, however, hold his power long, for about 6 years after his return he was again expelled. He refused to treat the daughter of Megacles as his wife, and being afraid, in consequence of a combination of the two opposing parties, he retired from the country. First he led a colony to a place called Ryculus, in the region of the Thermaic Gulf, and thence he passed to the country in the neighborhood of Mount Pangaeus. Here he acquired wealth and hired mercenaries, and not till 10 years had elapsed did he return to Eretria and make an attempt to recover the government by force. In this he had the assistance of many allies, notably the Thebans and Lygdames of Naxos, and also the knights who held the supreme power in the constitution of Eretria. After his victory in the battle of Pellene, he recovered the sovereignty, and when he had disarmed the people, he at last had his tyranny securely established, and was able to take Naxos and set up Lygdames as ruler there. He effected the disarmament of the people in the following manner. He held a review in full armor in the Theseum, and began to make a speech to the people. He spoke, however, in a low voice, and when the people called out that they could not hear him, he bade them come up to the entrance of the Acropolis, in order that his voice might be better heard. Then, while he continued to speak to them at great length, men whom he had appointed for the purpose collected the arms, and locked them up in the neighboring chambers of the Theseum, and came and made a signal to him. Pisistratus, accordingly, when he had finished the rest of what he had to say, told the people also what had happened to their arms, adding that they were not to be surprised or alarmed, but go home and attend to their private affairs, while he would for the future manage all the business of the state. Chapter 16. Such was the origin and such the vicissitudes of the tyranny of Pisistratus. His administration was temperate, as has been said before, and more like constitutional government than a tyranny. Not only was he in every respect humane and mild, and ready to forgive those who offended, but in addition he advanced money to the poorer people to help them in their labors, so that they might make their living by agriculture. In this he had two objects. First, that they might not spend their time in the city, but might be scattered over all the face of the country; and secondly, that, being moderately well off and occupied with their own business, they might have neither the wish nor the time to attend to public affairs. At the same time his revenues were increased by the thorough cultivation of the country, since he imposed a tax of 1/10 on all the produce. For the same reasons he instituted the local justices, and often made expeditions in person into the country to inspect it, and to settle disputes between individuals, that they might not come into the city and neglect their farms. It was in one of these progresses that, as the story goes, Pisistratus had his adventure with the man in the district of Hymettus, who was cultivating the spot afterwards known as tax-free farm. He saw a man digging and working at a very stony piece of ground with a stake, and, being surprised, he sent his attendant to ask what he got out of this plot of land. "Aches and pains," said the man, "and of these Pisistratus has got to have his tenth." The man spoke without knowing who his questioner was, but Pisistratus was so pleased with his frank speech and his industry that he granted him exemption from all taxes. And so, in matters in general, he burdened the people as little as possible with his government, but always cultivated peace and kept them in all quietness. Hence, the tyranny of Pisistratus was often spoken of proverbially as quote, "the age of gold," close quote, since later the government became much harsher, owing to the excesses of his sons. The quality which received most praise of all was his popular and kindly disposition. In his whole administration he was accustomed to observe the laws without giving himself any exceptional privileges. Once he was summoned on a charge of homicide before the Areopagus, and he appeared in person to make his defense. But the prosecutor was afraid to present himself, and abandoned the case. For these reasons his government continued long, and whenever he was expelled, he regained his position easily. The majority alike of the upper class and of the people were in his favor. The former he won by his social intercourse with them, the latter by the assistance which he gave to their private purses, and his nature fitted him to win the hearts of both. Moreover, the laws in reference to tyrants at that time in force at Athens were very mild, especially the one which applies more particularly to the establishment of a tyranny. The law ran as follows: quote, "These are the ancestral statutes of the Athenians. If any persons shall make an attempt to establish a tyranny, or if any person shall join in setting up a tyranny, he shall lose his civic rights, both himself and his whole house." Close quote. Chapter 17. Thus did Pisistratus grow old in the possession of power, and he died a natural death in the archonship of Philonius, 33 years from the time at which he first established himself as tyrant, during 19 of which he was in the possession of power, the rest he spent in exile. It is evident from this that the story is mere gossip which states that Pisistratus was the youthful favourite of Solon, and commanded in the war against Megara for the recovery of Salamis. It will not harmonize with their respective ages, as any one may see who will reckon up the years of the life of each of them, and the dates at which they died. After the death of Pisistratus, his sons took up the government, and conducted it on the same system. He had two sons by his first and legitimate wife, Hippias and Hipparchus, and two by his Argive consort, Iophon and Hegesistratos, who had the surname of Thessalos. For Pisistratus took a wife from Argos of the name of Timonassa, the daughter of a man of Argos named Gorgilus. She had previously been the wife of Archinos of Ambracia, one of the descendants of Kypselos. This was the origin of his friendship with the Argives, and 1,000 of them were brought over by Hegesistratos, and fought on his side in the battle at Pellene. Some authorities say that this marriage took place after his first expulsion from Athens, others while he was in possession of the government. Chapter 18. Hippias and Hipparchus assumed the control of affairs on grounds alike of standing and of age, but Hippias, as being the elder, and being also naturally of a statesmanlike and shrewd disposition, was really the head of the government. Hipparchus was youthful in disposition, amorous, and fond of literature, and it was he who invited to Athens Anacreon, Simonides, and the other poets. Thessalos was much junior in age, and was violent and headstrong in his behavior. It was from his character that all the evils arose which befell the house. He became enamored of Harmodius, and, since he failed to win his affection, he lost all restraint upon his passion, and after several other insults, he finally manifested his rage by forbidding the sister of Harmodius to take the part of a basket-bearer in the Panathenaic procession, insulting Harmodius at the same time by alleging as his reason that he was a person of loose life. The result of this was that Harmodius and Aristogiton, in a frenzy of wrath, did their celebrated deed in conjunction with a number of confederates. But while they were watching Hippias in the Acropolis during the Panathenaea (Hippias at this moment was awaiting the arrival of the procession, while Hipparchus was organizing its dispatch), they saw one of the persons privy to the plot talking familiarly with him. Thinking that he was betraying them, and desiring to do something before they were arrested, they rushed down and made their attempt without waiting for the rest of their confederates, and killed Hipparchus near the Leocorium while he was engaged in arranging the procession. This, however, ruined the design as a whole, and of the two leaders, Harmodius was killed on the spot by the guards, while Aristogiton was arrested later and perished after suffering long tortures. While under the torture, he accused many persons who belonged by birth to the most distinguished families, and were also personal friends of the tyrants. At first the government could find no clue to the conspiracy, for the current story, that Hippias made all who were taking part in the procession leave their arms, and then detected those who were carrying secret daggers, cannot be true, since at that time they did not bear arms in the processions, this being a custom instituted at a later period by the democracy. According to the story of the popular party, Aristogiton accused the friends of the tyrants with the deliberate intention that the latter might commit an impious act, and at the same time weaken themselves, by putting to death innocent men who were their own friends. Others say that he told no falsehood, but was betraying the actual accomplices. At last, when for all his efforts he could not obtain release by death, he promised to give further information against a number of other persons, and having induced Hippias to give him his hand to confirm his word, as soon as he had hold of it, he reviled him for giving his hand to the murderer of his brother, till Hippias, in a frenzy of rage, lost control of himself, and drew out his dagger and dispatched him. Chapter 19. After this event, the tyranny became much harsher. In consequence of his vengeance for his brother, and of the execution and banishment of a large number of persons, Hippias became a distrustful and an embittered man. About 3 years after the death of Hipparchus, finding his position in the city insecure, he set about fortifying Munichia, with the intention of removing thither. While he was still engaged on this work, however, he was expelled by Cleomenes, king of Lacedaemon, in consequence of the Spartans being continually warned by oracles to overthrow the tyranny. The oracles were obtained in the following way. The Athenian exiles, headed by the Alcmeonidae, could not by their own power effect their return, but failed continually in their attempts. Among their other failures, they fortified a post in Attica, Lipsydrium, above Mount Parnes, and were there joined by some partisans from the city. But they were besieged by the tyrants, and reduced to surrender. After this disaster, the following became a popular drinking song. Quote, Ah, for Lipsydrium, name of woe and treachery! Ah, for the men laid low, nobly born, and great indeed! Well did they prove themselves at need of noble sires, a noble seed. Having failed then in every other method, they took the contract for rebuilding the temple at Delphi, using for that purpose the considerable wealth which they possessed, with the view of securing the help of the Lacedaemonians. The Pythia, accordingly, was continually enjoining on the Lacedaemonians, who came to consult the oracle, that they must free Athens, till finally she succeeded in turning the Spartans in that direction, although the house of Pisistratus was connected with them by ties of hospitality. At the same time, The resolution of the Lacedaemonians was at least equally due to the friendship which had been formed between the house of Pisistratus and Argos. Accordingly, they first sent Anchimolus by sea at the head of an army, but he was defeated and killed through the arrival of Cineas of Thessaly to support the sons of Pisistratus with a force of 1,000 horsemen. Then, being roused to anger by this disaster, they sent their king, Cleomenes, by land at the head of a larger force, and he, after defeating the Thessalian cavalry, when they attempted to intercept his march into Attica, shut up Hippias within what was known as the Pelargic Wall, and blockaded him there with the assistance of the Athenians. While he was sitting down before the place, it so happened that the sons of the Pisistratidae were captured in an attempt to make their escape from the country, upon which the tyrants capitulated on condition of the safety of their children, and surrendered the Acropolis to the Athenians, 5 days being first allowed them to remove their effects. This took place in the archonship of Harpactides, after they had held the tyranny for about 17 years, since their father's death, or in all, including the period of their father's rule, for 49 years. Chapter 20. After the overthrow of the tyranny, the rival leaders in the state were Isagoras, son of Tisander, a partisan of the tyrants, and Cleisthenes, who belonged to the family of the Alcmeonidae. Cleisthenes, being beaten in the political clubs, attracted the people to his side by giving the franchise to the masses. Thereupon, Isagoras, finding himself left inferior in power, invited Cleomenes, who was united to him by ties of hospitality, to return to Athens, and persuaded him to, quote, drive out the pollution, a plea derived from the fact that the Alcmeonidae were supposed to be under the curse of pollution. On this, Cleisthenes, with a few of his adherents, retired from the country, and Cleomenes expelled, as polluted, 700 Athenian families. Having effected this, he next attempted to dissolve the council, and to set up Isagoras and 300 of his partisans as the supreme power in the state. The council, however, resisted. The populace flocked together, and Cleomenes and Isagoras, with their adherents, took refuge in the Acropolis. Here the people sat down and besieged them for 2 days, and on the 3rd they agreed to let Cleomenes and all his followers depart, while they sent to summon Cleisthenes and the other exiles back to Athens. When the people had thus obtained the command of affairs, Cleisthenes was their chief and the leader of the people, and this was natural, for the Alcmeonidae were perhaps the chief cause of the expulsion of the tyrants, and for the greater part of their rule they were at perpetual war with them. But even earlier than the attempts of the Alcmeonidae, Sidon made an attack on the tyrants, whence there was also a popular drinking song addressed to him. Quote, pour a health yet again, boy, to Sidon. Forget not this duty to do, if a health is an honor befitting the name of a good man and true. Close quote. Chapter 21. The people, therefore, had good reason to place confidence in Cleisthenes. Accordingly, when at this time he found himself at the head of the masses, 3 years after the expulsion of the tyrants, in the archonship of Isagoras, his first step was to distribute the whole population into 10 tribes in place of the existing 4, with the object of intermixing the members of the different tribes, so that more persons might have a share in the franchise. From this arose the saying, quote, do not look at the tribes, addressed to those who wished to scrutinize the lists of the old families. Next, he made the council to consist of 500 members instead of 400, each tribe now contributing 50, whereas formerly each had sent 100. The reason why he did not organize the people into 12 tribes was that he might not have to divide them according to the already existing tridies, For the 4 tribes had 12 tridias, so that he would not have achieved his object of redistributing the population in fresh combinations. Further, he divided the country by demes into 30 parts, 10 from the districts about the city, 10 from the coast, and 10 from the interior. These he called tridias, and he assigned 3 of them by lot to each tribe in such a way that each should have 1 portion in each of these 3 divisions. All who lived in any given deme he declared fellow demesmen, to the end that the new citizens might not be exposed by the habitual use of family names, but that men might be known by the names of their demes. And accordingly it is by the names of their demes that the Athenians still speak of one another. He also instituted demarchs, who had the same duties as the previously existing naukrati, the demes being made to take the place of the naukratis. He gave names to the demes, some from the localities to which they belonged, some from the persons who founded them, since some of them no longer corresponded to localities possessing names. On the other hand, he allowed everyone to retain his family and clan and religious rights according to ancestral custom. The names given to the tribes were the 10 which the Pythia appointed out of the 100 selected national heroes. End of chapter 21.